In 1882, Italy entered the Triple Alliance. This was an alliance between Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. The Triple Alliance was a defensive pact, which said that if any of the three nations were attacked by two or more nations, then they would defend each other. It was originally due to expire on July 8, 1914, but was renewed in 1912. With this renewal came an addition to the treaty. This was Article 7, which, quote, guaranteed both signatories compensation should either make a permanent or temporary gain of territory in the Balkans, end quote. This meant that Italy warned Austria-Hungary that if they went to war in the Balkans, they would want compensation. Austria-Hungary then sent an ultimatum to Serbia and invaded without informing Italy. Austria-Hungary also didn't give Italy compensation, so they remained neutral. After this, in 1915, Italy joined the Entente and beat back the Austro-Hungarians, eventually winning the war. What if this changed? All we need to change is Austria-Hungary informing Italy that they are going to send the ultimatum to Serbia and invade, and then Austria-Hungary giving them compensation. This wouldn't guarantee the Italians join the Central Powers, but they will for the sake of this scenario. Let's say the Italians join the war right when it starts. This would open up an entirely new front in the Alps of southern France. This would mean the French would have to send a large portion of their army to the south. The Italians joining would also reduce the Entente's investment from the US and other parts of the world because there would be lower confidence in the Entente winning. This would mean that throughout the war, the Entente would have less funding. This wouldn't significantly affect the war until the later stages. The Italians switching sides would bring a total of about 5 million extra men to the Central Powers, while depriving the Entente of that many troops. The beginning of the war. To start off, let's say that the Austro-Hungarians compensate Italy with South Tyrol and Istria to guarantee their loyalty. The Austro-Hungarians likely wouldn't accept this, but let's say they do for the sake of the scenario. In the beginning of the war, the front would be similar to the German front, with early gains being made and the front stalling. In this timeline, the Germans would likely have made it further into France because of this Italian distraction. They may possibly even capture Paris, but even if the Germans did, they would leave because they wouldn't want to hold on to an enemy city of nearly 3 million on an enemy front line. These extra German gains would also hurt the French industry because of how industrialized the North was. Aside from this, the war would pretty much go historically, with the Germans and Italians being kicked out of Africa and the Germans making gains in the east. It's possible the Entente would try to invade Sicily or Sardinia, but I find it relatively unlikely. By 1916, the Central Powers would be in a very nice position, with the Balkans nearly completely controlled, Romania over half occupied, Poland and parts of the Baltic occupied, nearly all of Belgium occupied, and parts of France in the north and south occupied. By 1916, the decreased investment in the Entente by the Americans would start to kick in. In our timeline, the British financed nearly the entire Entente's war effort. The Entente beside Britain were just hopelessly unprepared economically for this war. In our timeline, the British started running out of money around 1916 to 1917. This is when American loans that the British took out basically financed the entire war effort until the war ended. This would mean the Entente's military would be just slightly weaker compared to our timelines, 1916. This would start compounding as the war continued. At this point, I'm going to go into two scenarios, one where the US joins the war and one where the US doesn't. By 1917, the war would be seen as a certain Central Power victory. With the Russians collapsing and great territorial gains in the east, there would be plenty of freed up German soldiers heading east, and Ukrainian grain would start getting sent to starving Germans. The only fronts remaining would be in the Middle East and West. This would all be in vain, though. In 1917, the Germans would restart unrestricted submarine warfare after about a 2-year pause. This would greatly anger the Americans, nearly guaranteeing their entry. This was until the Zimmermann telegram, which all just put the American troops in France. With this, the Americans would join. In this timeline, the Germans would still do their last desperate offensive. It's likely the Italians would also launch a last desperate offensive. It's a possibility the Germans would capture Paris, but I find it unlikely this would crack France because of the hundreds of thousands of American troops on their way. With this, the Greeks would join the war, causing the dominoes to fall. Bulgaria would surrender first, followed by the Ottomans, Austro-Hungarians, Italians, and Germans. Overall, the terms of the treaty would be practically the same, possibly slightly less harsh because of the Americans contributing more to the war, but overall historical except for Italy. Libya would be granted to the French, while the British would get Eritrea and Somalia. French Somaliland may be slightly expanded into Eritrea. Roads would be given to the Greeks, and the Franco-Italian border may be moved slightly further east. Tyrol is an interesting case. I could see it either given to Italy, given to Austria, or partitioned among ethnic lines. I see it being partitioned among ethnic lines most likely. The Serbs would also get Istria from the Italians. Along with all of this, the Italians would have to pay reparations. Overall, this piece makes Europe very similar to our timeline, except for a slightly more consolidated Africa and a slightly smaller Italy. All this would likely change as Mussolini rising to power quicker and having a slightly smaller Italy compared to our timeline. Let's now get into the next scenario. In this scenario, let's say the Germans decide not to go ahead with unrestricted submarine warfare because of the much better position compared to our timeline. This would mean the Germans would see the Americans joining as a lot less of a possibility, causing them not to send the Zimmerman telegram. With this, the Germans would, with men from the east, start offensives. These would all be with one goal: capturing Paris. The Italians may also launch offensive. In this timeline, when the Greeks joined the war, instead of it collapsing the Central Powers, the Bulgarians and Austro-Hungarians would hold them back. This may be with German or Italian help. The war would seem increasingly unwinnable for the Entente, so when Paris would fall, they would agree to peace. In the peace, the Italians would get Savoy, Corsica, and Tunisia. I see the possibility they get French Somaliland, British Somaliland, and a slight expansion of Italian Somalia. This would depend on Italian participation in the war. They may also get a protector over Albania. The Germans would move their borders slightly west and get all of the eastern lands, and create a small Middle Africa. The Ottomans would just get the Caucasus, and possibly small Middle Eastern lands from the British. The Bulgarians would get Dobruja, Macedonia, Greek Macedonia, and more lands from Serbia. The Austro-Hungarians would get a puppet on Montenegro and what's left of Serbia, and the Romanians would get Moldova and slightly more from the Russians. If you enjoyed this alternate history, you could leave a comment to help me against the algorithm.